The area that this book tackles is very important in the history of psychiatry, but also of religion. Carl GustavJung, as a religious figure, as a cult leader, and I'm using cult in the traditional sense, is an important aspect to be studied. Like I have said in many recent videos on the topic, all schools of psychiatry, at the end of it all, are truly religions of the self. Mystery religions, to be even more specific. And all of them have different twists, different perspectives. Some are more Gnostic, some are more traditionalist. And this book explores Jung at that level. If you want to learn more about it, stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing all these things helps the channel out, and I appreciate it. Also, check out my Ko-Fi website. I'll put it here on the screen, and follow me on X. If you do these things, subscribe, donate a single amount or recurring amount, it will really help finance the project, and I appreciate it. In this episode, I'm going over The Erring in Christ, The Secret Life of Carl Jung by Richard Noll, published in 1997 by Random House. This edition is hardcover, but like I always say, content is king. Find whichever one you want, and I will put in the pinned comment my Amazon affiliate link, and you can see all the books I review, or most of them, whichever ones are available in Amazon. And when you buy it through that link, the channel gets a small percentage. Now, the author of this book has come to the conclusion that Jung believed himself to be a prophet and places him in the same tier as Julian the Apostate in the sense of his impact on Christianity and how people view Christianity during his time. So, basically, as a force of opposition to traditional Christianity, directing people towards paganism, similar to Julian the Apostate. So that gives you an idea of the point of view of the author, which again, I think is very interesting and important to study from that perspective. Now, I think that to understand Jung himself, I agree with the author that you must understand certain aspects of how he viewed spirituality, because he does come from an important family, and his grandfather and his father were themselves quite experimental on these topics. And since he was very young, he did encounter very creative and strange approaches to the topic. He was into spiritism, speaking with the dead, and other creative outlets that I think really impacted his viewpoint on Christianity and the way that said religion interacts with his culture. Also, for Jung, Goethe's Faust was a new religious dispensation. He saw that book almost as a Bible of sorts. So as you can well imagine, someone that views that book in that fashion is already traveling in a different road than what you would call normative religion. Well, at least normative during his time. Also, the influence and impact of the German spiritual revival of his time, piggybacking on German Romanticism, which is one of my favorite topics actually, this switch from a highly cerebral, intellectual mood to a more instinctive, intuitive forms of artistic expression. And obviously this kind of approach would eventually lead to what you would call a pagan revival in Europe, with the Germanic strain in particular at its head. And you see this at the time with thinkers like von Liebenfels and von List, and I would even say Villegut. In a minor degree, of course, he did have an impact politically by influencing one of the most notorious and impactful political organizations at the time. But you see it just in general, a revival of sorts that starts from a very subterranean energy that is influencing politics and influencing the people in general. And when I say subterranean, I don't mean this in a negative way per se. I mean it in the Platonic Jungian sense, like an inner drum beating of the ancient world that remains in the background and kind of starts fueling up past concepts and archetypes, almost like a boiling pot. Now, for example, Freud, who was deeply influential to many of his students, including Jung, sold himself and was seen by his followers as a sort of messianic figure, which makes sense when you look at the cultural background of Freud, that his mood would go more towards the messianic instead of towards Odin, for example. And this is relevant from Jung's perspective, actually. But this is kind of the point, that these schools of psychiatry acted and behaved and studied in a way that resembled religious sects and saw their leaders as either messianic figures or prophetic figures or avatars of sorts. And you have to understand that most of the students in these schools stem from traditional religious backgrounds. So any person that comes along and says, hey, I have the answer to all the questions that religion claims to answer, but I have new answers for them. And these answers deal with the problem of evil. They deal with metaphysics, philosophy, aesthetics, ethics. Well, obviously, it's occupying the space of religion, and it is inevitable that they will function in that fashion. For this reason, let me give you a few quotes from the book that I think will frame this topic very nicely. To give you the context of the quote, you did have some psychiatrists that noticed the religious component of all these groups and pointed them out in many letters and lectures. And because today most people don't even know about this or think about it, because they love seeing psychiatry as a so-called legitimate science, whatever that means, it requires me to quote things to kind of underscore the important fact that most people saw it as what it is in the beginning. So here's a quote from Webster of what he calls the psychoanalytic church, in particular addressing Freud. Quote, "In placing what was, in effect, a confessional ritual at the very heart of the psychoanalytic movement, it seems clear that Freud was not, as he himself believed, engaging in a form of scientific innovation. Rather, he was unconsciously institutionalizing his own profound religious traditionalism at the same time that he was creating for himself a ritual stage on which he could play out his own God complex in relation to patients he regarded as inferior and in need of redemption. Just as, through his history of infantile sexuality, he had revised in disguised technical form the doctrine of original sin, so he also brought back to life, under a clinical disguise, the most important ecclesiastical ritual which had traditional help to sustain that doctrine, and to create psychological dependency among those who burden themselves in the secrecy of the confession." So in that quote, it's very fascinating because Freud is Jewish, he's not a Christian, and nonetheless Webster is ascribing to him original sin, which is fascinating because you do see that in rabbinical Judaism, but not in the way that Christians see it. And he's also ascribing to him the confessional component, which again is more of a Catholic thing, but he's ascribing it to Freud's intentionality because of the structure of the psychoanalytical ritual. And by the way, all psychiatry schools have the same structure. So I think he's doing primarily a blanket analysis of the entire structure of the entire system across different sects and different schools. Now the next quote is the author citing Jung and then giving his comment right after. Quote, "Such a mass movement would, of course, be the new religion of modernity, psychoanalysis." Jung wrote, quote, "I imagine a far finer and more comprehensive task for psychoanalysis than alliance with an ethical fraternity. I think we must give it time to infiltrate into people from many centers, to revivify among intellectuals a feeling for symbol and myth, ever so gently to transform Christ back into the soothsaying God of the vine, which he was, and in this way absorb those ecstatic instinctual forces of Christianity for the one purpose of making the cult and the sacred myth that they once were. A drunken feast of joy when man regained the ethos and holiness of an animal. This was the beauty and purpose of classical religion." End of quote. Had the letter ended there, it would have been stunning enough. But Jung insisted that a biologically and evolutionarily correct ethical development must arise from within Christianity and must bring to fruition its hymn of love, the agony and ecstasy over the dying and resurgent God, the mystic power of the wine, the awesome anthropophagy of the Last Supper. Only this ethical development can serve the vital forces of religion. So very powerful stuff. Again, you see Jung going with the flow of the Christian mystery religion, as he would see it, as a Dionysian cult that has lost its way, which is kind of the particular paganized conception of Christianity that was very popular at that turn of the century, 18th century, 19th century. As you can see, Jung is going all in and visualizes psychoanalysis as a revival of something older. Now, whereas Freud rather keep the language of science and the jargon of this new form of pseudoscience, as some people would call it at the time, Jung was a lot more comfortable with just going straight up into myth and legend, which is what makes Jung so fascinating, to me at least. Now, in this book, the mention of Otto Gross is fundamental because of the influence that he had. And as you read the book, you'll find out more about him. I'll put a note in my description to give you a little bit of his background. He was the son of a famous criminologist, and he was actually treated by many of the most important psychiatrists of the time. Jung found him very fascinating when he was treating him. He was trying to fix him because he was a degenerate and a pervert of many sorts and highly controversial at the time. He gave his father a lot of issues, would escape from mental institutions, and had a whole philosophy of life, basically a Nietzschean hybrid with hedonism. But that perspective, that twist that Gross gave to philosophy was impactful. And there are many letters from Jung specifically addressing this issue. Because he would say things like, Gross is psychoanalyzing me. He was very intelligent, very capable. But it did change Jung because it made him feel that he was still being controlled, trapped by Christian morality. And Gross advocated for polygamy, for example, and doing evil, as he called it, to break away from the mold. So this form of antinomian spirituality, which is actually very common in Satanism and certain schools of occultism, was really influential, and you can see a very clear origin in Otto Gross. And from that, Jung developed his own conception of the universe is made out of chaos, and existence itself, because it comes out of chaos, is balance between the masculine and the feminine, the negative and the positive. So you have a form of dualism, which you do find in other psychiatric schools, actually, and in most schools of occultism, because they stem from a ancient pagan view, which in a lot of ways held this. If you look at the Norse myths, you will see this as the basis of all existence. You know, elementals bouncing against each other, and from there you get the gods. Basically, consciousness comes out of nothing, which, interestingly enough, is similar to the scientific perspective, or at least their answer to the question of creation or existence or reality. So Jung treats analysis itself as a form of initiation, a method of entering into the mysteries of the interior, the occult self. And this is very similar to all the other schools, including Hubbard, which I mentioned in a recent video as I go through a Scientology playlist, that Hubbard himself had this notion as well, a duality, and the auditing itself as a form of analysis, which is itself a form of confessional, which itself is a form of inner exploration. So all these concepts are there in all these schools, and they just have different names for them. Now, Jung was a devotee of abraxas, and he would structure sermons. The most famous one is called the Seven Sermons, in which he would guide you through a process until he convinced you of the supreme power of this deity in particular. He was the hidden god of good and evil, the unification of this duality in existence, which is fascinating because it generates a trinity, actually. And a lot of these ideas stem from Catholic theological explorations of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the dialectics that developed after Thomas Aquinas, and you see it flourish and then sprout this new movement. And a lot of these ideas stem from that, right? So the Holy Spirit would be the synthesis of the Father and the Son, who seem to be at opposites, which is a perspective that you see a lot in the Catholic theological schools, although you do not see that in the Orthodox schools. So Abraxas becomes this god that synthesizes ideas. And of course, no book on Jung is going to be finished unless the whole topic of the religion of the blood is discussed, which was very popular at the time, but it has a controversial aspect to it because people are familiar with its association with the Second World War, the Third Reich, etc. So because of that association, it becomes taboo, unfortunately, to even talk about it. But a lot of these psychiatrists believed in the racial soul, for example, or the fact that culture matters and ethnicity matters and language is important and it impacts your psyche and how you relate to others, and inheritance also mattered. And of course, to this day, it matters. They just have to couch it in different terms and kind of speak around it. People have become cowardly when it comes to the topic, but at the time, they were not. And I actually appreciate the fact that this book is not preachy. For some reason, I expected the author to go into a diatribe of how Jung was pure evil for even entertaining these ideas. And he doesn't, which is great. It allows the reader to make his own conclusions and think about the topic without being injected with emotional propaganda. And on that topic, let me give you another quote, which I think is interesting. Quote, Jung's German spirituality was never more apparent. His references to the rootedness of one's spirituality, of the fact that one's spirituality must come from one's blood, and the appeal to stay within the boundaries of one's mystical landscape. In a 1918 essay, The Role of the Unconscious, Jung used rootedness to argue that the psychoanalysis of Freud and Alfred Adler could apply only to Jews. Jung argued that Germans would find Jewish psychoanalysis unsatisfying. Analytical psychology is therefore an Aryan science and form of spiritual psychotherapy that can truly assist only those of Aryan blood. Whereas Jung considered the English an extension of Germanic blood, his tolerance did not extend to Slavs such as Uspensky. The English were Aryans. They would be redeemed with his methods. Slavs, although originally Aryan, had too much Asian blood mixed in, they would have a difficult time. Jews could not be redeemed. So as you can see in this quote, the influence of culture, the collective unconscious, which was actually directed at specific groups. So you would have collective unconscious of all existence, of all humanity, but you would also have a national spirit of sorts. And his salvific methodology was really a group psychological approach. And this was actually the main tension between the schools of psychoanalysis, which are basically the Freudian schools, and the Jungian schools. At least at the time, because today these schools still exist, but they don't really speak in these terms anymore, and it's highly controversial to do so. So you'll usually not hear them speaking this way anymore. But that was actually the core issue at the time. And I would argue that if you're a Jungian, you would have to kind of admit that this is an important component, and if you're Freudian as well. And fearlessness breeds better science and better theology, in my opinion. So the key to Jung was myth, And he saw myth as higher than historical truth. And obviously this is a clear contrast with Christianity, who views history as an important locus of legitimacy. And I'm not saying that Christianity doesn't have elements of that history that could be mythical of some sort, or at least perceived that way. What I'm saying is that for Christianity, the biblical narrative is rooted in the notion that it is an actual, true history of humanity. And anything that seems to be mythical, like donkey speaking and things like this, are only sprinkled as part of a fantastical element of the story. But the historical aspect that is happening must be true. Like St. Paul said, if the resurrection of Christ did not happen, then this is all foolishness. I'm paraphrasing, of course. The literal resurrection of Christ is the key, whereas in many of the pagan traditions, the literal historicity of their claim was irrelevant because they viewed the myth as being higher than historicity. So you didn't have to prove that Apollo did X and Y. You didn't really have to prove that Krishna did lift Govardhan Hill, if we go to India, for example. Now, they believe it happened, but it doesn't require historical proof, or at least they're willing to accept allegory as a possible interpretation of the story, which is also important. There's a flexibility there that Jung advocates for. So all in all, great book, a very important, meaningful book in the sense of how it discusses the topics, but also it has a occultic flavor that I think it's a lot of fun to read. Going into the mind of Jung and seeing it from that left-hand path perspective is a great approach. And it will really enhance your understanding of psychiatry in general. So, highly recommend it. Go through my link in the pinned comment and check out the editions available for you. Hopefully you enjoyed this review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing all these things really helps, and I appreciate it. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.